What would you do if you reached the absolute pinnacle of power, only to discover that you had gained everything except the one thing you actually needed? King Gray had strength, he had influence, he had a kingdom. But behind the crown was a man who had spent his entire life alone. He had become powerful enough to control the world around him, yet he had no one he could truly trust. And when his life finally came to an end, Gray thought his story was over. But he was wrong, because death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something completely unexpected. To everyone around him, Arthur looked like an ordinary child. But behind those young eyes was the mind of a former king. He remembered his previous life. He remembered the battles, the politics, the loneliness, and most importantly, he remembered the mistakes that had made him the person he once was. Now Arthur had the opportunity to start again, but there was one problem. He was trapped inside the body of a baby. He couldn't fight, he couldn't walk, he couldn't even properly communicate. So, for the first time in his life, the former King Gray had to learn patience. And as Arthur grew older, he slowly began discovering that this new world was nothing like the one he had left behind. Arthur's new family was completely different from the life he had known before. His father, Reynolds, was a former adventurer who had chosen a quieter life. His mother, Alice, gave Arthur something he had never truly possessed in his previous existence: a loving family. For the first time, Arthur experienced something that power could never buy: a home. He was no longer a lonely king sitting on a throne. He was a son, and slowly, something inside Arthur began to change. The more love he received from his parents, the more he realized that his second life wasn't supposed to be a repeat of his first. This time, he wanted to protect the people he loved. But Arthur was still Arthur, and his curiosity about this new world was impossible to stop. Arthur soon discovered that the world around him was filled with something completely unknown to his previous life: magic. This world was powered by mana. People could train their bodies, strengthen their abilities, and eventually use magic through their mana cores. To most children, learning magic was something that came with age. But Arthur wasn't an ordinary child. He already possessed the discipline and knowledge of an adult, and he wanted to understand his new power as quickly as possible. Because Arthur knew one simple truth: in a dangerous world, being weak meant depending on others, and Arthur had no intention of remaining powerless. So Arthur began experimenting with mana. He trained his mind, he studied his body, and he patiently tried to understand how the magical energy of this world worked. But his young body had limits. Arthur quickly discovered that having the mind of an adult didn't mean having the physical strength of one. He couldn't simply force his body to do everything he wanted. Still, Arthur refused to give up. Every mistake became a lesson, every failure became information, and little by little, he began to understand the power inside him. Arthur's journey wasn't easy. His desire to become stronger sometimes pushed him beyond what his young body could safely handle. But instead of giving up, he adapted. This was one of the biggest differences between Arthur and ordinary children. He didn't see failure as the end. He saw it as a problem that needed to be solved, and that mindset came from his previous life as King Gray. But this time, Arthur wasn't chasing power just to sit above everyone else. He was learning how to become strong enough to protect the people who had given him a reason to live. As Arthur continued developing his abilities, he began to realize just how unusual his potential really was. His previous life had given him discipline. His new life gave him something even more valuable: a chance to combine that discipline with magic. Arthur was no longer just a reincarnated king. He was becoming something completely new. A fighter who could combine experience from a previous lifetime with the limitless possibilities of mana. But Arthur's peaceful childhood would not last forever, because one day he would encounter a creature that would completely change the direction of his life. During one of his adventures, Arthur encountered something almost impossible to believe: a dragon. But this wasn't a powerful creature attacking him. The dragon was injured, and Arthur quickly realized that she needed help. Her name was Sylvia. This encounter was far more important than Arthur could have imagined, because Sylvia wasn't simply a mythical creature. She was connected to a much larger conflict. A conflict involving powerful beings and forces that Arthur didn't yet understand. Before their meeting came to an end, Sylvia entrusted Arthur with something mysterious. And with that single encounter, Arthur's peaceful life began moving toward a much darker future. Arthur slowly began to realize that the world he had been born into was much more dangerous than it appeared. There were powerful beings hiding in the shadows. There were enemies he couldn't yet understand. And there were conflicts that had existed long before Arthur was even born. But Arthur had something most people didn't. He knew how to think like a strategist. He knew how to stay calm when others panicked. And he understood that sometimes the greatest weapon wasn't raw strength, it was information. Arthur knew that if he wanted to protect his family, he would eventually need to become much stronger. And his journey was about to take him far away from home. As Arthur grew older, his world became larger. He wanted to explore. He wanted to learn, and he wanted to understand the limits of his abilities. Eventually, his journey took him away from the peaceful life he had known with his parents. Leaving his family wasn't easy, because unlike the old King Gray, Arthur now had something worth losing, people he genuinely loved. But Arthur also understood that staying weak would put those same people in danger, so he stepped forward, not as King Gray, but as Arthur Lewin, a young boy carrying the memories of an old life and the hopes of a new one.